David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show. I voted. I've got my I voted sticker. I know Pat has his as well. His is much, much bigger than mine, interestingly. He's sort of created a combination of two I voted stickers. And I mean, he clearly just has way too much time on his hands. And we're going to talk about that after the show, Pat, believe me. Okay, let's get right into election predictions and whether I will once again be very, very wrong in my election predictions. I want to just issue the sort of disclaimer, and I know that there are many people in our audience who don't need me to issue this disclaimer. They know that I was very wrong in terms of my 2016 prediction, in the sense that I thought that Hillary Clinton would win, and she didn't win. So why anyone would listen to my predictions at this point, I really don't know. But Pat so far has not had a terrible track record, so we'll get some of his predictions momentarily. So I've already said, and I still believe, generally speaking, that Democrats are going to take the House of Representatives and that Republicans are going to keep the Senate. This is not an extraordinarily risky prediction, and it's not an extraordinarily unpredictable prediction, but it still all has to happen, and it's ultimately going to come down to voter turnout. And now I want to go into a little bit more detail about exactly what I think the numbers are going to be. We will know very, very soon, within hours, whether I am right, wrong, or I guess somewhere in between. So let's start with the Senate here. I believe that Republicans are likely to hold the Senate. The caveat is that if turnout is up the way it's been reported in Texas for Beto O'Rourke, and despite being down in the polls against Ted Cruz, Beto O'Rourke ends up winning, that's going to be a signal that there could be a major shakeup and a sort of insurgent left around the country. But I believe at this point in time that the most statistically likely scenario is Republicans gain one seat in the Senate. This is not because there's a lack of a blue wave or no anti-Trump Democratic momentum, because in the Senate, unlike in the House, not every seat is up every election. A third of the Senate is up every 2 years for re-election, and the set of Senate seats that are up for election right now are not particularly favorable to Democrats, because Democrats have way more seats to defend, I guess the right way to say it would be, and fewer Republican seats that they even could take over. And then, of course, when you look at which Republican seats are up for re-election, they are mostly very solid red states. So I think that some interesting races include Indiana, where Joe Donnelly has a pretty good shot of defeating the Republican Mike Braun. Arizona is an interesting one, where Democrat Kirsten Sinema is right in there with Martha McSally. And then you've got Bill Nelson, who's the Democrat in Florida, against Rick Scott, doing well. And then it would be huge if Jackie Rosen, the Democrat in Nevada, always got to say it that way, was able to defeat the incumbent Republican Dean Heller. Meanwhile, incumbent Democrat John Tester in Montana could actually end up losing his seat to Republican challenger Matt Rosendale, but Tester's ahead in the polls, just not really by as much as we would like to see an incumbent Democrat lead the day of the election, or I looked at the polls yesterday, the day before the election. So that's the Senate for me. Now, before I get to the House, Pat, do you differ with me in terms of the Senate?
I do indeed. I'm going bold here. I'm going to predict that Democrats will take the Senate. I could break it down a little bit if you want. I think Bredesen in Tennessee and Heidkamp in North Dakota are going to lose their respective races, but the power of incumbency, I think, is going to help quite a few Democrats. I think it's going to help Tester and Donnelly and Bill Nelson in Florida and Claire McCaskill in Missouri. And then there are quite a few toss-up races that I think will go blue because, hey, it's a midterm election year and Republicans are in charge. That tends to help the party that's not in power. So I think that Rosen's going to win in Nevada, and I think that Sinema is going to win in Arizona. That would put everything at 50-50. The tiebreaker, I think, and this is a big, bold prediction, Beto O'Rourke is going to defeat Ted Cruz. I said it here first. You can quote me tomorrow.
Yeah. Listen, if I think that what you're accurately thinking about is that a lot of these races are within the margin of error. And if turnout is up slightly and Democratic enthusiasm is higher than Republican enthusiasm, that it's unlikely to be just one race that sort of breaks from the norm or the trend. And you may well be right. Your prediction, by the way, statistically would also not be a drastic outlier. And that's sort of the issue when you have so many races within within the margin of error. So Pat says Democrats take the Senate. I say I think the most likely scenario is that they don't. But believe me, I will be here gladly admitting my mistake if tomorrow we can tell you that the Democrats have taken over the Senate. Then we've got the House. I believe that in the House, the Democrats will take control. They will gain somewhere between 35 and 45 seats. They only need 25 to take over control of the House, so it really shouldn't be close unless the polls are not so much very wrong, but just if everything within the margin of error goes for Republicans. Democrats have gerrymandering and voter suppression working against them. But as Pat mentioned, historically, the party that wins the White House loses in the next midterms. Didn't happen with George W. Bush in 2002. Sort of unique circumstances. It usually does, and big new voter registration numbers for Democrats. Do you agree on House, Pat?
I do agree on House. I think Democrats will take the House. I think that's a much more surefire prediction. Some races to look at. How about Steve King versus J.D. Scholten? I really hope that Scholten can pull it off there.
That would be huge. I really hope J.D. Scholten replaces Steve King. So then let's talk about governors' races. Right now we have 33 Republican governors, 16 Democratic governors, 1 independent, Bill Walker in Alaska. In the end, if Democrats gain, it will be 1 or 2. Okay? I think Andrew Gillum has a really great shot in Florida to turn that governor's mansion blue. Iowa could go blue. Wisconsin could switch to blue. Republicans likely are going to take Alaska from the independent, and that will go red. Illinois has a Republican incumbent and will almost certainly go blue. And beyond that, it's going to be mostly the same party remaining in control. So that's like a +1 or a +2 for Democrats if things go roughly as expected. So is this enough for what, right? What are we looking to have happen? In the House, if Democrats take over, that means actual investigations into more than just Trump, into all of the corruption that we've seen so far. It means more control over spending. It means more control over taxes. It means being able to force some negotiation to get things done, which simply isn't necessary for Republicans to concede when they control everything. Winning the House probably changes the tenor of the 2020 election, which is about to start, by the way, and I'm told by some people very close to some of the bigger potential Democratic candidates that we could see announcements very early in 2019 about the 2020 presidential race. So what we need to be worried about is the 2016 election repeating, which means you got to go vote. You got to go vote. Every single one of you needs to vote. I voted. If you haven't voted yet, depending on when you're listening to this, you can still go vote, and I encourage you to do that. Let's now talk about a couple of voter suppression stories on Election Day. Listen very, very carefully to this next story. Remember how Democratic challenger Beto O'Rourke is running against disgusting, depraved, extremist Republican Senator Ted Cruz in Texas? And I've been telling you for months that you can vote today to kick Ted Cruz out of the Senate. Well, the Border Patrol has decided to conduct a crowd control exercise today, Election Day, in El Paso, Texas, which happens to be where Beto O'Rourke lives and enjoys some nice levels of support. And they are going to be conducting this crowd control exercise right between a Latino neighborhood and a nearby polling place where many of those Latino voters are going to be voting. That's right. Border Patrol, in what they call a mobile field force demonstration on Election Day, in a neighborhood populated almost exclusively by Latino voters and adjacent to where many of them vote, will be in full force with this exercise. The ACLU is furious. Members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus are disgusted. And you can either attribute bad faith or ignorance to this, and either way, it's horrifying. Either Border Patrol is doing this deliberately to create an intimidating and tense situation for people who are realistically going to mostly support Beto O'Rourke, or they are completely ignorant about the idiocy of doing this not only on Election Day, but literally between where a group of people that is historically disadvantaged is going to be trying to transit through in order to get to their polling place. And you can say they got to file a lawsuit. Screw them. They only need to intimidate enough people today to make a difference, and then file whatever lawsuits you want. It's going to be too late. Now, in most polls, as we mentioned, yeah, Ted Cruz is up around 6 points, so it may not really matter in the end. But then why do it at all? If you experience this personally, I would say let me know, but we're out of time. You've got to let local law enforcement know. Maybe they'll listen. You've got to let the Election Commission know. You've got to let your Secretary of State know, because it is same day voter suppression that is going on. And I have more voter suppression to talk to you about, unfortunately. We've spoken about Georgia's Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, before. He is not only the Secretary of State of Georgia, but he is also the Republican candidate running against Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams. The guy running the election as Secretary of State is also the guy on the Republican ticket. Absolutely despicable. And he's been using voter suppression tactics of all kinds, the purging of voters from the voter rolls, the closure of polling places in strategically located areas, strategically for them to close them, that is, reduction of early voting hours, all sorts of techniques. And now at the last minute, Brian Kemp is launching an investigation into supposed attempts by Democrats to hack the voting system. So what actually happened here? A lawyer representing election security groups got a tip. And what that tip said is that it might be possible to change voter information in Georgia's voter registration system. So the lawyer said, oh, I should report that to the Secretary of State. And he went and he told Brian Kemp's office about that. Kemp then released a statement saying Democrats are trying to hack the system, when in reality, there's no evidence of that at this time. And then, of course, once again, it's reported as news that Georgia Dems are under investigation for trying to hack voter systems. This is such a ploy to simply make Democrats look bad. And we know that Brian Kemp doesn't actually care about election security, because we've been calling him out for years for not addressing election security issues in Georgia. In 2016, he turned down the Department of Homeland Security money to provide election security and cybersecurity help. In 2015, Georgia accidentally shared a whole bunch of CDs with Social Security numbers and voter information for 6 million voters. Last year, they had another breach that exposed the data of 7 million voters. So it's not credible at all, Pat, that if he's so concerned about election security, that he wouldn't do anything about every single one of these issues for the last 3 or more years. This is a joke. This is an obvious attempt to suppress the vote. And unfortunately, the media outlets are buying into it by saying Dems under investigation for voter hacking.
Yeah, this is what Republicans are good at. They're not good at going out there and winning the hearts and minds of the voters. They have to resort to these sorts of tactics. But the good news is, if you go out and vote today in Georgia, you can put a stop to it, get them out of power so they can't resort to this kind of stuff.
You got to hand it to them. They are way better at this stuff than the left. They use these tactics. They use them cumulatively to win elections over time. So we can either play their game, which I don't like, or we can vote, because when races are close, you can use these tactics to get a couple of points and win. If the left increased its voter turnout by 10%, 12%, none of this garbage would work anymore. We're going to see how it works out today very, very soon. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. It's election day.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today is a very special day because I have 2 new members to thank on what is going to be the last day that the coupon code Vote Soon 18 is going to be available. Avraham Jacobson is today's new member of the day. David Newton is today's longtime member of the day. He's been with us for more than 5 years, since 2013. Avraham, David, thank you. You can join them at a 40% discount with the coupon code VOTESOON18 at www.joinpacman.com. Only up until midnight tonight, and then that code is gone forever. And I'll have to come up with a clever one related to 2020, probably tomorrow, or maybe late tonight if the election goes that long. On the eve of the midterm elections, the president has issued one more threat to people who are planning to vote illegally today or who have already been voting illegally early. They're going to get you, is what Donald Trump is saying. This is Trump continuing the farce, because that's what it is, of pretending that in-person voter fraud is anything other than Republicans trying to test the system and often getting caught. Check out what Donald Trump tweeted yesterday. Quote, law enforcement has been strongly notified. What the hell does that even mean? To watch closely for any illegal voting, which may take place in Tuesday's election or early voting. Anyone caught will be subjected to the capitalized maximum criminal penalties allowed by law. Thank you. Let's understand the reality here. And by the way, this is a good opportunity to mention, I didn't literally mean yesterday when I did my story about how fact-checking Trump is an exercise in futility. I didn't literally mean we shouldn't talk about the truth or falsity of what Donald Trump says. But my point yesterday was to get Trump supporters to abandon him, pointing out that he lies isn't really a good strategy since they don't actually care about the truth and they've been primed to disregard the truth when it conflicts with their view. But there is, of course, still value in discussing how the world really is. And the world really is one where in the United States, an election commission was created by Donald Trump when he said 3 to 5 million people voted illegally for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. That voter fraud commission, his own voter fraud commission run by the truly horrible Chris Kobach, found no evidence of voter fraud. And then the commission was disbanded almost a year ago, very quietly, even though we reported on it, and you barely heard anything about it since, other than the fact that Trump still insists that these illegal votes are actually a problem. What do we know about voter fraud in this form, in this in-person style? What we know is that the cases are mostly of Republicans who say, I'm going to prove to them how easy it is to show up and do voter fraud. And they get caught because it is against the law and it's not actually that easy to do. And of course, Donald Trump talks endlessly about people double registered and people registered to vote, meaning people registered to vote in two places, people voting for dead people and all of this stuff. First of all, as I've said before, and I know I'm a broken record on this, being registered in two places just isn't a problem and it's not against the law as long as you're not trying to vote in two places. That's number one. I was registered for a while in at my old address and my new address, but I never actually tried to go and vote at both, so it's no problem. But then, of course, it turned out that the people around Trump themselves actually did or had associated with them a lot of the characteristics that Donald Trump said we should be concerned about. So as an example, Stephen Bannon was registered somewhere he didn't actually live. Trump's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was registered as a woman. And I know at the time all sorts of jokes were made about it. It's an error, but it's an incorrect voter registration. Trump's daughter, Tiffany Trump, was registered in two places. So as usual, Pat, when Trump pushed the 3 to 5 million people voted illegally thing, either he was knowingly lying or he had fallen into believing the conspiracy theory himself. In the end, it doesn't matter. Although I believe that he does believe it because reports are he talks privately about this as well. It's not just stuff he tweets about.
And we didn't need Trump's failed voter fraud commission to know that this just really isn't a significant issue. The Brennan Center for Justice took a look at this, something like 15 years. They took a look at 1 billion votes, and there were only maybe 20, 30 cases of voter fraud. And I think part of the reason for that is just because the penalty for it is so severe. I mean, you can go to jail for 5 years. You can get fined $10,000. Not many people are willing to do that over just one seemingly inconsequential vote. It's not a big problem.
Indeed. And by the way, it's also important to mention that they have this amazing circular reasoning where they say tons of people are doing this. And then you say exactly what you just said. 1.3 billion or however many votes were accounted for. 20-something instances. They'll say, well, that's because the people doing it aren't getting caught. But then they go to do it to show how easy it is, and they get caught. So to believe what they're saying, you have to believe that the undocumented immigrants, the people on the left who are doing this at a scale of millions of votes, are way more skilled at doing it than the Republicans who seem to get caught every time. And if that's your argument, you have to explain why. Like, why are the people on the left who are doing the illegal voting able to get away with it when the people on the right seem to keep getting caught? And I haven't heard a good explanation for that. So bottom line, Trump's lying about voter fraud. He's lying about the immigrant caravan. And it's sort of secondary whether these are deliberate lies or whether he believes this trash the way that his own supporters do. It only matters if people value the truth. And as I told you about yesterday, and I got a lot of positive feedback about that story, and some people who misunderstood it, they don't. Right now, the truth is not valued as a pillar of political honesty and ideology. And that's why we need numbers and simply to get more people voting than them. And we'll know very soon whether or not we got that this time around. I love this next story because I've been speaking out against anti-Semitic Louis Farrakhan for a very long time. If you don't know who Louis Farrakhan is, I'm jealous of you, first of all, I should say, but I'm going to tell you anyway. He's a black nationalist. He's the leader of the Nation of Islam, which is a Southern Poverty Law Center tracked hate group. It's a black supremacist anti-Semitic group. Unfortunately, there are people on the left who like Louis Farrakhan. And in fact, I did a story back in March of this year explaining that there's this coziness and admiration from some of the leaders of the Women's March with and of Louis Farrakhan, which is exactly what the left needs to get away from, needs to run away from as fast as they can possibly run, because it's truly and really toxic. So cut to yesterday when Donald Trump Jr. tweets an article about Louis Farrakhan showing up in Iran and chanting "Death to America." And he asks in his tweet, when will the Democrats disavow this guy? Answer, never. This is particularly hilarious because Louis Farrakhan is a Trump supporter. Back in 2016, I did a story about Louis Farrakhan, who praised Donald Trump for, quote, standing up to the Jewish community, whatever that means. And this is why it's so important to understand. It doesn't matter if Trump's personally anti-Semitic. It doesn't matter if Trump's personally a white supremacist. If the white supremacists see Trump as their guy, then that is all they need. In this case, an anti-Semitic black supremacist, Louis Farrakhan, identified that Trump was signaling the way he liked, I guess, on issues of whatever it means to stand up to the Jewish community. Here's another clip of Farrakhan from just months ago talking about how good Trump is.
Well, that wasn't the intent of this administration to do a lot of good for us. But the nature of this administration is good for us. Because now, sometimes you think you're where you are not. And so Trump is letting you know where you really stand. And because of Trump's way, he is an anomaly. There's never been no president quite like Mr. Trump. But there's something that he's doing. I'm going to come out in a few weeks and talk about it. But Trump is destroying every enemy that was an enemy of our rise.
Yeah, so I'm going to remind you that Donald Trump Jr. is saying the problem is that Democrats won't disavow Louis Farrakhan. I agree with Trump Jr. Democrats should disavow Louis Farrakhan if it comes up, although he's not really that involved with Democrats anyway, although his connection to the Women's March leaders is very concerning, but he's on the record as a Trump supporter dating all the way back to 2016. And to go further, there are prominent right-wingers who have celebrated Farrakhan's praise of Trump. It's more projection from the right. Remember our favorite new politically awakened right-winger Candace Owens. She tweeted a few months ago, but has since deleted the tweet, as she often does. I guess this one wasn't a good idea to tweet this. She said, quote, "In no way do I endorse Farrakhan's views, but holy crap, this is a really big deal. He has just aligned himself with the Trump administration. What is going on in the black community right now is unprecedented. Flag this, it's relevant." And then Glenn Beck agreed, tweeting, "This is huge. Candace Owens is correct. And it is the principle of what caused all of our damage in the Middle East. It never leads to peace. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We must find reconciliation in our hearts." Why isn't, Pat, Donald Trump Jr. concerned that Farrakhan likes his dad and that fellow right-wingers have celebrated that praise because it's getting black people off the plantation, as they like to say? I don't get it, but he seems to just not have the facts.
I just think it's ignorance. I don't think that Donald Trump Jr. has seen the update now that Louis Farrakhan supports Trump. And you pointed out Candace Owens and Glenn Beck there. I think most people on the right are against Farrakhan. And in fact, they've used him as a way to argue against identity politics, because they made it seem as if the left supports Farrakhan, even though he's an anti-Semite, because he's black, because he's a Muslim. And apparently those two things rank higher than Jews in the oppression hierarchy. But maybe you would see that could have some merit, right, as a way to argue against identity politics, but it completely falls apart once you find out that Farrakhan's now apparently a Trump supporter.
Everything is backwards. I mean, they literally say the opposite of what is true on issue after issue after issue, and that's exactly why we have to vote them out, and we're actually doing something. So producer Max posted to the David Pakman Show Instagram account today, at David Pakman Show, a picture of Pat behind the scenes with his gigantic, oversized, comically enormous I voted sticker. And we're encouraging people to post your own I voted images and tag at David Pakman Show on Instagram. Tell us what issue got you out to the polls today. And while you're on Instagram and following the show, follow me as well. I'm on there as David.Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Erica Walker, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Boston University's School of Public Health, also director of the Community Noise Lab. Erica, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start. I mean, for people who don't know the effect of noise in their environment and how this can impact mental health and physical health, big picture it for us. I mean, what are the considerations when we think about what types and level of noise can be bad for humans to be exposed to on a regular basis?
Well, if you look at traditional epidemiological literature, you'll see that when we describe sound in our communities, we typically describe it by its loudness. And we see that loudness as low as 40 A-weighted decibels can you can see changes in your mood, annoyance, irritation. And then as we move up, 40, 50, 65 decibels, we begin to see more serious disease manifestation, such as cardiovascular disorders, myocardial infarction, high blood pressure, up to 65 decibels.
Yeah, I mean, just when I hear that truck backing up near your office, I immediately start to sense that I feel like I'm sweating a tiny bit, and I start to not. It's funny because we had an office situation for the last 3 years up until a few weeks ago, where it was basically a building that was constantly under construction, and because we work in sound, we happen to have a decibel meter, and it's very clear that once the noise gets to a certain level, concentration becomes difficult. There is a physical impact. And this is something that I'm guessing disproportionately impacts people who are not wealthy. And a lot of the communities impacted disproportionately are the ones we would expect. Is that right?
That's very right. So, in some of the research, I released a noise report in 2016, and you could definitely see that in areas that were located near major transportation networks, so near airports, next to bus lines, train stations, those were typically the poorer communities, but they also had the higher noise levels. So, of course.
Sometimes when driving on highways, you will see these sort of wood, they look like they're wood, sort of barriers that are created. And I believe that the idea of those is to reduce highway noise for the communities that are nearby. Can you talk about that and other of the very common methods that are used and sort of how effective they are at mitigating noise?
That's assuming that cities take it seriously, right? So I've seen sound walls, but I think most of the mitigation strategies have typically been on a case-by-case basis. Some person with lots of money hires an acoustics firm, and they soundproof their homes. But other than that, it's sound walls. And then if you live near an airport, or sometimes if you live near a major highway, you can apply for, window treatments, but that's very strict criteria, very crazy criteria. So even if you live in those neighborhoods, you're not guaranteed the protections because you have to be eligible for the soundproofing criteria. But for me, in what I've seen, it seems to be mitigation strategies seem to be something that's available to people who can afford them. And those things that are available to those people who can afford them, a lot of people don't qualify for them.
Well, people may not know, and it's not. It would be understandable why that there was something called the Noise Control Act of 1972, and that was shut down. So can you talk a little bit about what that did and the sort of problem with getting rid of it?
So I think it sort of brought to our consciousness that noise was at that time a serious health issue, but that it was something that we would predict in the future would be equally serious. Sorry, I work near a hospital.
No problem.
My office is right next to the emergency room right there. So I think that it put us into this mindset of this noise is something that we need to talk about, and it's something that's going to get worse in the future if we don't do something about it. But I think that the dismantling of this Office of Noise Abatement has kind of left the regulation of noise to these very bucket kind of entities, primarily your city or your town. So it's just sort of put these things in silos. So there's no longer that framework to kind of make sure that everyone's speaking the same common language.
How do we kind of like define or categorize different types of noise? Because I can certainly imagine 2 or 3 or 5 different types of noise that are sort of the same decibel level if you were to measure it. But I think we can all sort of understand how the impact on mental health and our feeling would be very different. So like a white noise machine, for example, that is designed to maybe help you sleep better would be very different than other types of noise that might be equally loud. So how can we start thinking of how we might categorize noise?
Great question. So typically the way we've always talked about noise was how loud it was, right? We've talked about, oh, this is loud, this is loud, this is not loud. So we've very superficially defined how we talk about noise. And the way we regulate it is we regulate it using this A-weighted decibel that assumes that the noise that's important for us to regulate is the noise that we process through our auditory system. But research suggests that, number one, we don't process noise only through our auditory system. And in areas where there are high components of low frequency and high frequency noise. So frequency is another aspect of noise that we really don't take into consideration. They do more so in the occupational setting, but in our environmental community noise regulations, we just typically focus on the sounds that we can hear. So, if we live in a neighborhood where there are high levels of lower frequency and higher frequency noise, this A-weighted decibel, which says that because of there's only certain types of noise along certain frequencies that we process through the auditory system. Those other frequencies, those really low frequencies and those higher frequencies don't really matter. So when we were talking earlier about communities, poor communities, being louder, they're also more inundated with lower frequency and higher frequency sounds.
What are
So,
some examples of that?
okay, lower frequency sounds would be more of your rumblings. So, like in my case, the thing that got me interested in noise research was my neighbors upstairs who would thump all day. Thunder, bus engine, things that have a roar to it. Whereas higher frequencies are things like crickets, ambulance siren, things with a kind of airy kind of pitch to it. So we don't even consider that really when we talk about regulating our community soundscapes. So we talk about loudness, we sort of not really care about the frequencies. So in these poor communities, what I saw in my research was that not only are these communities poorer, but they also have more sources of lower and higher frequency sounds. What kind of calls into question is using this A-weighted decibel the appropriate way to regulate the soundscape. And then we talk about sound, but then we talk about noise being the unwanted aspect of sound, and we sort of really don't consider that. We assume that the unwantedness is the loudness of it, but it could be the character or the frequency. It could be the duration of it, and it could be from an individual's sensitivity or perception, which things we really don't consider and things we really don't regulate around. So there's sound that has its own components. There's noise, which has like community components and individual components, but things that we really don't talk about.
If you were to say, what are some of the sort of most relaxing or pleasing sounds I can imagine, being a completely untrained person in this field, I would sort of think about white noise machines that are designed specifically for, a therapy session to make it hard to hear what's going on, or for sleeping. Like I have one in my bedroom. Ocean and water type noises, and this can include also like rain, for example. What are, first of all, can you give us some examples of the noises that are known to be relaxing? But then also, like, how can we characterize them? What are their characteristics that we might identify?
So I think that, you talk about the white noise machine. I'm going to answer your question, but you talk about the white noise machine. So I think that sounds that we have control over are more likely to be more pleasant than anything. So I think noise is sort of like a proxy for control over our environmental soundscape.
Yeah.
So, I have a white noise machine in my home too. And when people come to visit me, they're like, "Oh, what is that? That's like so horrible sounding." And they want me to turn it off. But for me, it's a way that I can control my soundscape in my apartment. So to me, it's not noise, it's sound. But I think things that people traditionally have found to be pleasing would be, like you said, natural sounding sounds, but people like silence too. So I found there's like two camps, people who just like no sound at all, and then people are creeped out by that. And then people like music, classical music, soothing things, those kinds of things.
So let's talk about music a little bit. We learned some years ago that one of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques that was used in the Middle East included not just loud music, but specifically it seemed to be heavy metal music that was being used. So obviously we can all have opinions about heavy metal music, and those might differ. But can you talk from a sort of scientific perspective? What is it that makes heavy metal music of the style that was used in these enhanced interrogation techniques, which some of us call torture, what makes it materially different than other types of music?
I think the frequency composition of it, this is my opinion. I don't know what types of sounds what types of heavy metal music they use in these interrogation techniques, but it's loud probably, and it has like this kind of high frequency pitch that's like an annoying buzz in your ear. I don't know. I grew up in the country, and in the summertime you would get mosquitoes that would fly in your ear, and when they would get trapped, they would make this like high pitched sound, and to me that's just completely annoying. So I'm assuming it's the pitch. Probably higher pitches, and then the lower pitches as well, the lower frequencies, that kind of constant thumping in your chest over a period of time. And in my case, my situation, my neighbors above me, it drove me insane. It literally drove me insane.
Last thing I want to touch on is we have people who listen to our show all over the country, but they are heavily concentrated in places where lots of people live, like cities. So I get emails from people about upstairs noise outside, all sorts of stuff. Assuming you don't have a budget to have professional sound insulation and rooms within rooms built and all of the stuff that would be done professionally, what are like the most effective sound mitigation techniques that the average person in an apartment can do?
White, like masking it, so getting some sort of sound that you're comfortable with that offsets it. So white noise machines. I have a soundtrack that sounds like you're inside of an airplane. So it has like a rumbling because it keeps me from hearing the footsteps above me in the train outside. Earplugs work as long as you keep your ears healthy. Earplugs, noise cancellation, headphones. I find that those things work. And when you get too stressed, just leave your place and go out for a walk.
Yes, that seems like good advice. So we've been speaking with Erica Walker, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Boston University School of Public Health, also director of the Community Noise Lab. Erica, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me. Have a good one.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've got a really interesting little story that has developed around this extraordinarily racially tinged ad that was promoted by Donald Trump. This is a campaign ad that was posted on social media by Trump last week. And many people are understandably calling it racist. It was at minimum extraordinarily racially charged. And the ad tells the story of an illegal immigrant who entered the United States multiple times and was eventually sentenced to the death penalty for killing 2 police officers in 2014. And the ad asks, who else would Democrats let in? And the idea of the ad is just to frame Democrats as the party that's going to welcome these violent brown men into the country, regardless of what the law says. And before we even get into the specifics of the ad, this ad was banned by some television stations, okay? The president of the United States promoted an ad so racist that it was banned on television. Take that in for a second. The problem with the content of the ad is that the Sacramento Bee looked into the story, and it turns out that this man actually entered the United States when George W. Bush was president, and he was released for unknown reasons from detention, from incarceration, by that vile, depraved, extremist Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who has since been pardoned himself by President Donald Trump. The man's name is Luis Bracamontes, and it turns out that Bill Clinton had deported him. He came back to the United States, was arrested in Phoenix in 1998. Then he was released by Joe Arpaio. We don't know why. And then he was arrested by George W. Bush and deported again in 2001, came back to the U.S. in 2002, married in Arizona that year, according to records, and later he did end up arrested for killing 2 police officers. So obviously, this is a tragedy. This is horrifying. This is despicable. But what is also despicable is playing politics as if Democrats are to blame for this guy. Clinton deported him. He came back under Bush. A Republican sheriff who's a darling of Donald Trump's, Joe Arpaio, released him. And then he killed people when President Obama was president of the United States. There's nothing clear about the political ideology that's to blame here. If you wanted to push back and play politics with it from the left, you could say Joe Arpaio is known for treating inmates terribly. Was it Arpaio's treatment that pushed this guy over the edge to ultimately go and kill 2 police officers? I'm not making that argument. I'm pointing out how dumb it is. It's that case I just suggested is about as logical as the one that the ad makes, that Democrats are somehow responsible for this guy. But like I said yesterday, the truth doesn't matter. What the ad claims about Democrats being responsible is flat out false. But it doesn't matter, because anybody who's ignorant or horrible enough to be influenced by an ad like this will explain the fact-checking away as fake news, or they simply won't care that Democrats didn't actually have anything to do with that guy because it serves the greater good, because Democrats would allow all sorts of other criminals to come into the United States. It's depressing, and we know, Pat, from the calls that we've gotten, that it's getting to a lot of people in the audience. And at this point, I feel like it's just a matter of voting. You do have control over this type of rhetoric, in the sense that if we turned up our voter turnout by 10, 12, or 15%, the people influenced by ads like this wouldn't really make a difference in the elections. That's why I'm just telling everybody, Pat, you just got to go vote today, now.
Oh, absolutely. And I think under normal circumstances, the right way to rebuke an ad like this would be to say that this is just one anecdotal story, and by and large, overall, immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born citizens, that there are plenty of native-born people who go out there and kill cops. But you don't even have to get into all that stuff, because all you have to do is point out that he came in under Bush and that Joe Arpaio let him out. Argument over.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of those earlier arguments about the crime rate of undocumented and documented immigrants, we made those claims in our long-form piece about undocumented immigration. Look at some of the comments. If you are ready, and please don't let children see the comments on that video, if you are ready to see the depths of just the bottom of the barrel of political discussion, look at the comments on our exposition of the reality that, among other realities, undocumented and documented immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than American-born citizens. Some of the hardest hit people by Donald Trump's tariffs are soybean farmers. Soybeans are a really, really big deal. 12% of American exports to China are soybeans, according to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. China wanted a ton of soybeans, historically, increasingly. So farmers were producing more and more. And there's now a new study which points out that soybean sales to China are down 94% from the United States as a result of Donald Trump's tariffs. And this is a really key point. Trump doesn't even understand that when we put tariffs on Chinese goods, he talks about we're putting tariffs that China is paying for. No, we're not. China doesn't pay those tariffs. We are, when we buy stuff from them, which we need to do. Because when we stop getting source materials and components from China, the end products being created by American companies get more expensive. The costs are passed to the consumers. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that China buys stuff from us, but they've stopped buying soybeans because of the retaliatory tariffs that China has put on the United States responding to Trump's tariffs. So they're going elsewhere for soybeans, and the losers are who? Our farmers, as the corporations that do manufacturing are also increasingly losers under these tariffs. And you might say, well, David, you're cherry picking. Why are you focusing on just soybeans in China? It's anecdotal. Well, China is a top consumer of soybeans by a huge amount. If you look at the list, which we have up on the screen for you, you will see that China is, I mean, it's just not even close by how much China is the top consumer of soybeans. And the United States is, or at least was before these tariffs, one of the biggest exporters of soybeans in the world, behind Brazil. Unclear how Trump's tariffs are going to impact those numbers. And what's the solution that they claim to have come up with in the meantime while the tariffs crush farmers? It's the stuff of comic books almost. The Trump administration says, well, we will subsidize farmers who are getting hit by the tariffs. That's called socialization. They claim to be against that. That was the enemy, but they are simultaneously putting on tariffs that hurt the farmers and then using the government to socialize the soybean farmers or other farmers, depending on which crop we're talking about, in exactly the way they say is really bad. Socialism is bad. The government paying people not to grow is bad. And then on the tail end of it, at some point, I'm hoping that Trump figures out a way to get away from these tariffs. And when he does that, obviously, soybean exports are going to go up. And then what will you hear from Trump? I won. Soybean exports are up. Even if it was 1,000%, it would still only get us back to 2/3 of the previous soybean exports. They don't understand economics. They don't understand math. They don't understand geopolitics. And Pat, they are proud that they don't understand because Trump's going to win again after we've been losing for so long.
Yeah, maybe even Trump will abandon the soy farmers, start calling them soy boys. First thing you do is you go to a socialist policy and then you completely turn on them. I don't think that's going to help his re-election chances in a couple of years.
Well, you got to vote to end this insanity. That's the thing, because we're almost there. I know that I've been saying I'm not talking about 2020 until we get past 2018. We're very close to that. And we're going to start talking about 2020 very soon, partially because, as I mentioned, I've been speaking to some individuals close to some of the top possible Democratic contenders for 2020. The mood seems to be announce early. So we may even have announcements about 2020 sooner than you might imagine. But you got to go and vote today. Let's go to our voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I got a very fair question. I say it like I'm surprised. I got an unusually fair question in the voicemail today. Let's take a listen to it.
Hey, David. I just have a quick question here. So I was just wondering if there's any Republican policy issues that you support. I understand that a lot of the issues that the Republicans have been, campaigning on have been a lot of failed policies and are pretty regressive. And I was just wondering if there's at least like one or two policy issues from the Republican Party that...
Is that it? Did it get interrupted there?
Cuts off right there.
Wow. Okay. I understand the question. Where do I agree with Republicans? And quite frankly, the answer is areas that I agree with Republicans are pretty uncontroversial and Democrats are sort of on the same page. You might say, well, David, you've come out against toxic identity politics. That's something you agree with Republicans on. Not really, because Republicans drastically overstate the issue of toxic identity politics. I'm sort of with the sensible left on the fact that identity matters and we should listen to voices that have identity characteristics that make them tied to certain issues in particular ways. But I don't actually think that the issue is as big as Republicans say. So like even on that, I think I agree with the sensible left. I've talked about how I do agree with Donald Trump's tax plan in one sense, which is that it lowers the threshold at which point medical expenses become deductible. But that's not really a big policy position of the right. It's something that they threw into this particular bill. So I don't know. I mean, am I missing an area, Pat, where I agree with Republicans over the left, or are there any where you agree with Republicans over the left?
The only disagreements I can think of that I have with the left has to do with the fringe left. So I'm thinking of like GMO, the dangers of GMO. The anti-vaxxers community tends to be on the left, really just fringe stuff.
The anti-vaxxer community is an interesting one because it exists on the right for religious reasons and on the left for reasons of distrust of corporations. So that is an interesting one. But yeah, I agree. I disagree with the fringe left on vaccines and with the fringe right. I can't think of anything else, but I'll give it some thought. Please take the David Pakman Show audience survey. We've got it up for just a couple more days. It'll take you 90 seconds, davidpakman.com/survey. And please become a member, become a patron, support media that matters to you. Whatever the results today are, and I hope you will be a part, well, whether you vote or not, you're a part of the results because not voting is not neutral. But I hope you're a part of good outcomes today. We are going to have a very, very steep uphill battle for the next couple of years, and I would love to have your financial support through membership or through Patreon. And one of the things you would get if you were such a supporter is access to the bonus show, which starts in just a couple of minutes.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.